Recently, I put together a viewer-requested benchmark comparing the Core i5-12400F and Ryzen 5 7500F in a range of games to see which of these budget processors made the most sense to buy in late 2025. And in the end, the 7500F appeared like the smarter choice, offering stronger gaming performance and an actual upgrade path. Now, the only potential in for the 12400F was its ability to utilize DDR4 or DDR5 memory. And with DDR5 memory pricing going to the moon, maybe a DDR4-enabled 12400F would be a winning combo for budget gamers. And this was something a lot of you in the comments of that video said that you were keen to see, so that's what we'll be doing in this video. But before we get into it, this portion of today's video is sponsored by NZXT's Performance Fans, designed to combine premium cooling performance, impressive visuals, and ease of installation all in one. The fan frame and blades are constructed from a liquid crystal polymer, an advanced plastic that's much stiffer and more heat resistant than materials typically used in PC fans. This stiffness means the blades and frame don't flex or warp, even at high speeds and elevated temperatures, keeping airflow consistent and reducing vibration-related noise. Moreover, because liquid crystal polymer is so strong and precise when molded, the blades can be made thinner and positioned closer to the frame edges, which reduces turbulence and improves cooling efficiency. All models, even the multi-fan versions, feature just a single wire which includes a 4-pin PWM connector along with an RGB connector. All models also include aluminium side panels and subtle RGB lighting effects. Finally, all are backed by a 5-year warranty, so for more information, please click the link in the video description. Okay, so in the past, we've done quite a bit of DDR4 versus DDR5 benchmarking. Just last year, for example, I compared the performance of several LJ1700 processors using DDR4 and DDR5 memory, though it has to be said the 12400F was not featured in that testing. Generally though, what I found was Intel's older 12th gen models benefited most from the faster memory, seeing on average around a 20% improvement, with a slightly smaller 15% uplift for the 13th and 14th gen models. However, the performance gains were much the same for the various different models within the same generation. So Core i5, i7 and i9 processors all saw a similar performance uplift with DDR5 memory. That being the case, the data we've collected using the Core i5-12400F really will apply directly to parts like the 12600K, 12700K and even the 12900K, while it also roughly translates to what you'll see with the newer 13th and 14th gen parts. Now, a trend we've noticed over the past few years is that newer games are becoming increasingly demanding. I know, no shocker there, but they have continued to benefit more and more from increased memory bandwidth, which again makes sense. This has always been the way. But it's interesting to document these developments every 6 to 12 months, and today's updated look at DDR4 versus DDR5 will be introducing a number of games that we weren't able to test previously because they didn't exist yet. As for the memory configurations that I'll be using for this testing, representing DDR5 will be a 6000 CL30 kit, so the memory we used in the previous testing. Then for the DDR4 memory, we have a premium 3600 CL14 kit from G-Skill, which will be tested in both a Gear 1 and Gear 2 configuration. Gear 1's limited to 3200 speeds with my Core i5-12400F, as you can't adjust the VCC SA or VCC IO voltage, and this is the case with all locked Intel CPUs. Running it at 3600 will cause the entire system to lock up when loading Windows, forcing the Gear 1 configuration down to 3200 for stability. And since I've previously done all of this game testing with the Ryzen 5 7400F and 8400F, I've included that data here as a reference point, and it is relevant for those following on from the previous content. So, let's get into the data. Starting with Rainbow Six Siege, we don't see too much difference between the DDR4 3200 and 3600 configurations, though DDR5 6000 did offer a mild 7% performance boost when using the medium settings, so it's fair to say performance overall is similar using either DDR4 or DDR5 in this game. The Marvel Rivals results, though, are significantly different to what we saw in Rainbow Six Siege. For example, when using the medium quality settings, we see that DDR5 6000 is 33% faster, taking the average frame rate from 107 FPS to 142 FPS. That's a massive performance uplift. Even when using the more GPU limited Ultra Plus settings, we're still looking at a 24% performance improvement with DDR5 opposed to the low latency DDR4 3600. This also means, whereas the Ryzen 5 7400F is just 15% faster than the 12400F, when both CPUs are using the same DDR5 memory. If we were to pair the Core i5 with cheaper DDR4, the Ryzen processor ends up a massive 42% faster. So the additional bandwidth DDR5 provides makes a significant difference in this modern title. However, not all new games require loads of memory bandwidth from the CPU, and a good example of this is Assassin's Creed Shadows, which is very much a GPU-heavy game. Using the medium settings, the 1% lows were better using DDR5, but once we switched to the ultra-high preset, there's virtually no difference in performance between DDR4 and DDR5. Next, we have Horizon Zero Dawn Remastered, and this is another game where the bandwidth advantage of DDR5 is apparent. Using the medium settings, we saw a 24% performance boost when going from 3600 to 6000, and this margin was largely maintained with the ultra settings, as here DDR5 was 22% faster. And this is important to note because when using the same DDR5 6000 memory, the Ryzen 5 7500F was just 15% faster than the Core i5-12400F, but if the Core i5 processor was to be paired with DDR5 3600CL14 memory, the margin in favor of the Ryzen 5 processor balloons out to 41%. Another game that can really eat up system memory is Cyberpunk 2077. Now, using the medium preset, we're looking at a rather substantial 24% performance improvement when upgrading from DDR4 to DDR5, and this data is in line with past testing, which featured the Core i5-14600K, 12600K, Core i9-12900K, and 14900K. So in this example, the 7500F was 24% faster than the 12400F when both CPUs were using DDR5 6000, but if we downgrade the Core i5 with DDR4 3600, that margin grows to 51%. But where the margins really got out of hand is when increasing the CPU load by using the Ray Tracing Ultra preset. And this data is very interesting. Using DDR5 6000 memory, the 12400F was good for 88 FPS on average, making the 7500F 23% faster. And even that data is CPU limited and could therefore be achieved with a slower GPU. However, when we limit the 12400F with DDR5 3600 memory, it caps performance to just 66 FPS on average, making DDR5 33% faster in this example. Moreover, it means that the 7500F is now an incredible 64% faster. Next we have Counter-Strike 2, and the results here are a little different to what we've seen so far, and that's because the Gear 1 DDR4 3200 memory was around 7 to 8% faster than Gear 2 3600 configuration. So in this example, DDR5 was around 18% faster than the 3600 configuration, but just 10% faster than the 3200 configuration, suggesting this game is a little more memory latency sensitive than it is bandwidth sensitive. Space Marine 2 is a very demanding video game, and this is another example where the 12400F was much faster using DDR5 memory, delivering 24% greater performance, and this was seen using either the medium or ultra settings, as the data is heavily CPU limited. So you'd see this kind of margin with any GPU capable of rendering 80 FPS at your given quality settings, which is something a surprising amount of people don't seem to understand when it comes to CPU testing. It's really about the frame rate more than anything else, and I'll attempt to tackle this in a bit more detail towards the end of the video. Now moving on to The Last of Us Part 2 Remastered. This is another modern title that can really benefit from additional system memory bandwidth, as we're seeing a 21% performance improvement when upgrading the 12400F from DDR4 to DDR5, and this is seen when using the medium settings, but we're also seeing a 23% gain with the very high quality preset. So this is yet another example where the 7500F goes from being a bit faster than the 12400F when both are using DDR5 memory, 13% faster with the very high preset for example, to massively faster when limiting the Core i5 with DDR4 memory, almost 40% faster in fact. Now from past testing we know that Spider-Man games love memory bandwidth, whether that be system memory or VRAM, doesn't matter, loves all the bandwidth they can get. And this example we see when using the medium settings that the 12400F was 28% faster when using DDR5 opposed to DDR4, which is obviously a substantial performance difference. It also meant, whereas the 7500F was just 13% faster when both CPUs were using DDR5, it's now 44% faster when limiting the 12400F with DDR4. And memory bandwidth is at a real premium when enabling the ultimate ray tracing preset. In this example, The 12400F is 33% faster when using DDR5, and these are margins you will absolutely notice when gaming. Going from an average of 51 FPS to 68 FPS, that's a huge performance upgrade, and also meant that the 7500F was nearly 60% faster if we were to use the 12400F with DDR4 3600. Mafia the Old Country is a new game that already didn't play that well in the 12400F when compared to what we saw with the Ryzen 5 7500F, and even the cut down 8400F. So switching to DDR4 does the Core i5 no favors here, as the DDR5 configuration was 21% faster when using the medium settings and 29% faster with the EPIC settings, which again shows that the higher quality presets can indeed increase CPU load. And the EPIC data is particularly eye-opening, as it's here that we previously found that the 7500F was just 17% faster than the 12400F when both CPUs were using DDR5 memory. And granted, that's still quite a large margin, but when using DDR4 memory, the 7500F ends up 51% faster. Through past testing, we've learnt that ACC, like Counter-Strike for example, isn't very sensitive to system memory performance, whether that be latency or bandwidth. ACC is highly sensitive to CPU cache performance, as we've seen with the 3D V-cache processors, but when it comes to DDR4 versus DDR5 memory, the gains from the newer memory standard are fairly minimal here, as the 12400F saw up to a 13% performance gain. Finally, we have Baldur's Gate 3, and unlike ACC, this is a game that does take advantage of the additional memory bandwidth provided by DDR5. In this example, when using the medium preset, we're looking at a 30% increase in performance for the 12400F when upgrading from DDR4 3600 to DDR5 6000. That margin is reduced to 26% with the Ultra preset, but even so, in this example, we go from a situation where the 7500F was just 5% faster than the 12400F to one where it's 32% faster if we were to pair the Core i5 processor with DDR4 memory. Okay, so here's a look at the 12-game average, and we'll start by going over the medium data. Using DDR5 memory, the 12400F was comparable to the 8400F, making the 7500F 20% faster. The 12400F was also 20% faster on average when using DDR5 opposed to DDR4, and that means if using DDR4 memory, the 7500F would end up being around 45% faster on average, so that is a massive performance difference. Even when looking at the Ultra data, we're still seeing on average a 20% performance uplift for the 12400F when using DDR5 opposed to DDR4, and this also means whereas the 7500F was 18% faster than the 12400F when both were using DDR5, it'd end up 41% faster if you were to limit the Core i5 processor with DDR4 memory. So there you have it. As previous testing has shown, you're generally looking at around a 20% performance boost with DDR5 over DDR4, but of course some games are more memory sensitive than others, and as a result, you can see little to no uplift, like what we saw in Assassin's Creed Shadows, for example. But then we did see a massive 33% gain in a game like Cyberpunk 2077 with ray tracing enabled. Now, in my previous video comparing the 12400F and 7500F as budget gaming options, I noted that the CPU, motherboard and memory cost of the Ryzen 5 part was 27% greater when compared to the 12400F using DDR4 memory. But as we've just seen when using a DDR4 configuration, the 7500F ends up on average 41 to 45% faster depending on quality settings, making it not only considerably faster but also much better value. So that settles it really. Investing in DDR4 for a new system build or platform upgrade should be avoided at all costs. No pun intended. In my next video, I am going to see if saving money on DDR5 by buying a single 16GB module rather than two, see if that's a viable strategy, given the option to pay half as much right now and then pay much less on a second module when pricing inevitably comes back down in the future. Also, something else that I want to touch on in this video, because I already know there's going to be people in the comments telling me that 1080p testing is dumb or testing with an RTX 5090 is unrealistic and therefore the results are worthless, something along those lines. So for those people, I've got a few what I hope will be educational and eye-opening graphs. And I think for those of you that do understand why we test the way we do, this data might still also interest you, which is why I've included it. So hopefully this is something that those of you that accept and understand why CPU testing is done the way it is will find the following interesting. Now, the first example I have is with Cyberpunk 2077, and first let's look at the medium preset data. Assuming you're someone who has a high refresh rate monitor and therefore likes to play with at least 120 FPS, and therefore will enable suitable settings in an effort to achieve that desired frame rate, such as the medium preset for example, we see that the 12400F when paired with DDR4 memory is going to struggle. We also saw that the Ryzen 5 8400F for example was 36% faster, going from 107 FPS to 145 FPS. Now, some might say, sure, but you're testing at 1080p or you're using an RTX 5090 or maybe both of those things, and while they certainly would be right, as I am indeed doing that, they are missing the forest for the trees. What this data actually tells you very clearly is that the 12400F when paired with DDR4 memory under no circumstances will deliver more than around 107 FPS on average at these quality settings, and with DDR5 that cap is raised to 130 FPS. What it doesn't tell you is how many frames the RTX 5090 can actually render under these conditions, and the answer there, as we found with the 9800X3D, is at least 234 FPS. The data also doesn't tell you that you need an RTX 5090 to show the actual difference in performance between DDR4 and DDR5 memory, or even the difference between the 12400F and 7500F for that matter. And to prove this, I retested using the 9800X3D with the RTX 5060 Ti and RTX 5070 to show you what these GPUs can achieve under these same conditions. The RTX 5060 Ti, for example, can render 141 FPS on average, and what that means is the 35% margin that we see between the 12400F when paired with DDR4 memory and the Ryzen 5 8400F when using the RTX 5090 would be much the same had I tested with a 5060 Ti, for example. At least that specific example would be the same. So the point is, the 5060 Ti can enable a frame rate of just over 140, the 5070 can reach 175 FPS, and the 5090 well over 200 FPS. So if you're capped at 107 FPS because of your CPU, chances are you are heavily CPU limited with a graphics card equal to or greater than an RTX 5060 Ti. Now this can all change if you're targeting a lower frame rate or prioritizing visuals and are happy to play at lower frame rates to enjoy features such as ray tracing. And here we see with the Ray Tracing Ultra preset that you do need a very fast graphics card before CPU performance becomes an issue. The RTX 5070, for example, was only able to average 63 FPS, so if that's your target, then the difference between a CPU like the 12400F and 7500F is going to be pretty minimal. This information can be useful to know right now, but for those looking to upgrade their CPU for better gaming performance, it is misleading as this is a GPU test first and foremost, and therefore doesn't provide you with the correct information when it comes to purchasing a CPU. And Space Marine 2 is another good example of a very CPU demanding game, and there are plenty of CPU demanding games out there, we can't test all of them, but in this example, it should be very clear that testing with an RTX 5090 is not resulting in misleading data, as the RTX 5060 Ti, when paired with the 9800X3D, was much faster than both the 7500F and 12400F, despite those CPUs being paired with the RTX 5090, and this is true using either the medium or ultra quality settings. At best, I was able to achieve an average frame rate of just 84 FPS with the 12400F, that's in our Horde Battle test, and this was of course when pairing the CPU with DDR5 memory. So if you'd like more than 84 FPS in these intense battle scenes, you'll need a faster CPU than the 12400F, and if you require more than 97 FPS, you'll need something faster than even the 7500F. Though as we see with the 9800X3D, the limit right now is about 145 FPS using an RTX 5090, though we achieved 122 FPS with the RTX 5060 Ti when using the medium preset, because as I've said, this data is mostly CPU limited. But even in a game like Spider-Man 2, we see similar performance trends. When using the medium preset, the 12400F limited performance to 118 FPS with DDR4 and 151 FPS with DDR5, both great results really, but the 28% jump in performance isn't a misleading data set due to the fact that we're using the RTX 5090, because we're barely using the RTX 5090 in this example, given it should be rendering well over 200 FPS. In fact, you would see this exact same margin when using an RTX 5060 Ti, as that particular GPU can render 159 FPS in this very test. Now, when using the Ultimate Ray Tracing preset, we find a similar thing. Even with the RTX 5060 Ti, you'll still see a performance uplift when moving from DDR4 to DDR5 with the 12400F. Admittedly, the margin would shrink a little, but not much. In this example, you'll see the exact same margin using the RTX 5070 as you would with the RTX 5090. The RTX 5090 is merely used to try and minimize the GPU bottleneck for all of our testing, so we can actually look at the thing we've set out to test. In this example, CPU performance, and more specifically, how it's affected by memory performance. Anyway, hopefully those graphs helped explain the data a bit better, and if not, we have at least half a dozen highly detailed videos that explain in depth why CPUs are tested the way they are. But getting back to the subject of this video, it does seem like DDR4's days are over, so in my next video, I'll explore ways to save money with DDR5. But until then, like, subscribe, do all that stuff. We also have the join button or Patreon if you want to get more Hardware Unboxed goodness, access to our exclusive Discord server, monthly live streams, Q&A stuff, and behind-the-scenes content. So check that out if you're interested, but if not, it's perfectly fine. And I would like to thank you for watching this video. I'm your host, Steve. See you again next time.